one thing that Michelle and I share is a basic love of storytelling, I think, and radio, which often leads to storytelling. But I'm hoping Michelle will get into, and we'll get into as we go through this conversation, some of her more recent work, including We Are All Americans, which I think is a model and exceptional project that she guides with her students at Otis College. Michelle also has a background, to save you too much detail. I know she has a teaching certification. She's a teaching artist, of course, and has her MFA from Rhode Island School of Design, and also a BFA in sculpture and experimental studio. And notably, a minor in psychology, which I think plays no small part in your work. So she's been an educator for about 20 years, more than 20 years, I think, and we don't need to do the numbers. But she's going to talk about this. But one of her earlier experiences as a behavior therapist with kids with autism, students with autism. And hopefully you could talk about that the way you describe it, a very pivotal summer at a juvenile detention facility. So, and she's also a faculty member with Community Works Institute and the various institutes we do here in Los Angeles and otherwise. So welcome, Michelle. I hope I didn't go on too long.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks for joining us.
A great introduction.
Where would you like to start? What did I miss?
Let's start with, we were talking about Jaquist versus Jacquist, right?
Yeah.
It's actually, I have cousins, you saw on my Facebook post, I have cousins who say Jaquist, but my immediate family, we said Jacquist. But then, you know, everyone wants to be all socially conscious and say it Shaki or Hakis, however they think it's, if they think it's French or Spanish, but I say Jacquist.
You have had someone pronounce it Hakis?
I have. Once I moved to Los Angeles, they said Hakis.
Okay.
Yeah. So I like the way you described that I have an interest in storytelling, because I don't know that I ever even really thought of it that way, but it makes a lot of sense. As you said in the introduction, I studied sculpture. I was kind of trained in what we call the expanded field of sculpture. So installation art, performance art, video art, anything that takes up three-dimensional space can be sculpture, right? Social practice gets into that as well. And I in undergrad had like an aversion to what we used to call big man steel sculpture. The very like macho, you have to make big stuff. And I found that I was more attracted to the conceptual art projects that I was learning about, and performance art and video art. And I started getting into video and time-based medium, I think because my sculptures and installations were becoming more performative, and I was documenting that process. And then even in graduate school, continued to work a lot in video, got interested in what I would call, like at the time, I guess, not so much found footage, but like found situations, almost like a cinema verite style of shooting, where you don't stage things, you just record what's happening. But instead of putting that into documentary, I was putting that into experimental, non-linear, non-narrative video art. But I did do two kind of documentary projects early on in my career. One was a project called Conversations Between Daughters. And I thought I was going to make like a legit video documentary. I videotaped these conversations with myself and other women who grew up without living with their biological fathers. And it really varied from like some people who didn't know who their biological father was, some who thought they knew and turned out as an adult learned it was someone else, some who did grow up spending a lot of time with their father, but didn't live in the same household as him. It's a really wide range. And in the end, I ended up realizing I didn't want to cut all those conversations together. And it became a sound installation at the Long Beach Sound Walk back in like, I forget what year. I think I did the project around 2001, 2002. I can't remember what year it was exhibited that way, but it was set up as like cafe tables, sidewalk cafe tables, And each table had a CD player with 2 pairs of headphones. And so the audience, and then there were 5 tables, one for each conversation. And so the audience would sit 2 people at a time and share the listening in the conversation, but they're physically in the position as if they are the ones having the conversation because they're opposite each other at a cafe table. So that was like the first, I would say, like documentary project I did. And then I did another, you mentioned that I've worked as an ABA therapist with children with autism. So my sculpture professor at Hartford Art School, Hirokazu Fukawa, had 2 kids on the autism spectrum, and this was in the early 90s. And applied behavior analysis was developed at UCLA around the same time. We were in Hartford, Connecticut. So it was really challenging for him to find psychology students or even ABA practitioners in Connecticut. At that time, it hadn't quite reached the East Coast yet, I guess. I remember having a psychology professor in an abnormal psych class show us, Dr. Ivar Lovas from UCLA showed a video of his work with children with autism and then said, but that doesn't work. But I was doing it already with this child. I'd gotten very minimal, like it was very like, here's read some books and let me know if you want to work with my son kind of training. But I knew it was working because I could tell the improvements that Hirokazu's son was having and making. So when I worked with his son off and on for a few years when I still lived on the East Coast. And when I moved to Los Angeles in the summer of 2000, I was teaching, I started teaching at the college level that fall, but also needed income during the summers because I was only part-time faculty at a couple places. And Hiro and I were talking and he was like, the Center for Autism and Related Disorders, their international headquarters is in Los Angeles. You should reach out to them. So I worked for them often, for several years as a behavior therapist, doing one-on-one therapy in children's homes. When Dr. Doreen Grampachet, who runs the company, realized I was also teaching video art at the time Otis in UC Riverside, she was like, I have all these 3/4-inch videotapes in a closet from the 90s of kids in therapy and early diagnosis, and I'd like to follow up with them. So can I take you off all your cases and you work with me on this instead? So we followed up. In the end, we got 4 of those kids who are now adults, but at the time when we reached out to them, they were finishing high school and about to go to college. And we made the documentary Recovered: Journeys Through the Autism Spectrum and Back. So I think it's those 2 projects that I realized the benefit, social and emotional benefit of sharing one story, that it's cathartic to be able to share your story, even if it was a painful, traumatic story. And so I think a lot of what I've been focusing on since that documentary is work that combines strategies of documentary and conceptual art and social practice. And it, like you said, it varies. Like I'm doing a mix of drawing and embroidery and a podcast and video art and an artist book. So I'm kind of like all over the place material wise. But yeah, I guess storytelling comes into it, and I had not always thought of it that way, but it makes a lot of sense to me now. I think it's more about witnessing also.
Yeah, maybe if I can be helpful, I'm sometimes, with the work we're doing with Community Works Institute, I'm not going to storytell, but it started with storytelling somehow or other with kids in a rural community and stumbling and fumbling along. But I think storytelling it almost sounds like so-called, like a soft thing. Like, if you were going to talk to science teachers, where, by the way, storytelling is now a thing.
No, I know, yeah.
You know that. But it sounds somehow kind of soft, if you will, not like I'm not going to try to characterize it. But I think what we're talking about and what we share in common is it's and you've seen the Institute participants who've come to our institutes, and they go out and gather stories on the street, et cetera, et cetera. And they come back carrying those stories like they've just got the most important thing in the world, and they need to honor it and find a way to share it. And that's very different from a classic notion of storytelling.
Yeah. And I think that comes in, one of the classes I teach at Otis is community radio.
Yeah.
And it's in the creative action department at Otis. It's like Otis's version of service learning, although we don't call it that. And the students, each class is team taught. There's a typically with 2 faculty with different areas of expertise, and then the classes are all the majors together, and they work collaboratively on interdisciplinary teams in collaboration with each other, but also with a community partner. And in that community radio class, we spend a lot of time, we've taught it, myself and Gabby Strong and Mark Farina kind of alternate teaching this class with each other. And we've always taught it as, before we were even thinking about the terms diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, I feel like that was very much a part of the pedagogy of that class, is how do we share stories that are not told in mainstream media? How do we think about equitable representation of a diverse group of people? And so, there's one semester where I had probably the most intense semester of that class was in spring 2017, after Trump's inauguration. I had one student who was an Iraqi refugee in the US on political asylum and on a student visa, waiting for her green card. And she was spending her time going back and forth between the Otis campus and LAX to do language translation and interpretation for the Arabic speakers who were stuck due to the travel ban. And that made that kind of experience was happening. But then also we had a visiting artist, Taniel Morales from Mexico City, who spent a lot of time talking to the students about decentering mainstream media, but also mainstream culture. And we discovered in a class of 15, there were 12 different languages spoken among everyone. And I really encourage them, your radio shows don't have to be in English. Your audiences don't have to be English speaking audiences. They can be whoever you want them to be. And so we had really great work that semester of students talking about making shows of sharing culturally specific musical instruments from the specific parts of the world that they were from. We've had students do cooking shows where they interviewed international students, peers, about the kind of cultural missteps that happens when you're in a new place and you don't understand the culture yet or the language yet, but also they taught each other Mandarin and Korean. They talked about how to find the food they like in Los Angeles, but also did like cooking demos for how to cook the food that they miss from home. It was just really, I think, exciting semester of work. And I think that continues, we're always just encouraging the students to think about how do you share stories of voices that we wouldn't normally hear on mainstream radio.
Yes. And there are a couple of things I'd like, I think, if you could elaborate a little bit on, maybe separately or somehow interspersed. We with CWI, we work with core principles rather, and one of them that has just emerged over the last 20 years, it's incredibly important, is the idea of reciprocity.
That's been big in my work for decades, reciprocity.
Because some educators just intuitively think like this, and honestly, it's kind of a new thought process for others, and particularly for folks who come from not necessarily just the service orientation, but you know, and then you're familiar with the work we're doing with collaborative ethnography, which fits right into this. And I think what you're talking about, or if you could talk about, creating as a teacher, creating those intersections, those opportunities for something that has a shared interest by both parties.
Yeah, well, I think the idea of reciprocity started in my art practice before my teaching practice, really in graduate school. I was making participatory work. This was before in the late 90s, we didn't really have the discourse around social practice art. Relational aesthetics was just starting to get written about. Participatory work had existed, since Fluxus and before, but there wasn't a lot of written theory around what this work is like. And I think I would have had an easier time writing my thesis, my master's thesis, if that discourse had existed. Because I was making sculptures and performative video pieces that were participatory, and then being questioned by professors and visiting artists about, is it the experience that's important? Is it the final image or object that's important? And how necessary is it that people really interact with this? And why are you asking them to interact? What do they get out of it? And so that reciprocity became really important, that you can't just ask somebody to drink water out of your hands, which I did in a video in 99, without considering what that experience is like for them, and the intimacy and weirdness of that. And I think in all my work, I've really built that more, probably less, thought about it better now than I did in grad school, but about what is it that someone gets out of participating in this work, as opposed to me just taking from them. And I think that's why I'm really interested in the intersections of documentary and social practice, because the projects can get developed in collaboration with the subjects of the projects, as opposed to me being the ethnographer or the documentarian expert artist who says, I know how to tell your story. I think you just muted yourself.
Right, which is central to our point. I think that, and I don't want to be, and you're not, blind to, and it's not that much different for a college professor or instructor than a high school teacher, middle school, or fourth grade teacher, that you've got a limited amount of time to set something up and prepare your students. And
Mhm.
reciprocity complicates things, the idea of it, you know, and it's not the
Yeah.
old, I'm as guilty as anyone when I started out of what we could understand to be hit and run interview type things. And I'll take that. I mean, that's what we started doing. And at some point it didn't feel right and we got a little more sophisticated. But your metaphor of drinking water out of your hands, which is kind of weird in COVID times, but I get it. But
It wasn't a metaphor, it's an actual video that I can
oh, that's what you said. Can we see this
yeah.
video?
Well, eventually, it's like, it's not digitized. It was shot on high 8. It
Oh, high
exists.
8. Oh my God.
It exists on. I have video stills I can send you.
Well, I have high 8 video and it's never going to see the light of day, time based.
Yeah.
It's in boxes. But seriously, the drinking water out of each other's hands is where you go with that metaphor.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Did
Right.
I, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That it's
Water is knowledge.
yeah.
Water is experience.
And I think with teaching, it's partly why I feel really lucky that I'm at a point in my career where I teach juniors in college, and I teach in a department that allows me to say, this is the community partner I want to work with. And the department also expects that the projects are very student driven and driven in collaboration with the students and the partner. So my syllabi are very open ended a lot of the times. Like I have some, um, you know, benchmarks of deadlines for certain things, but there's also, yeah, and then certain, it's not like when I taught intro video art and I needed to teach them how to use a camera, how to edit video. And we had like 3 assignments that would scaffold those technical skills, right? In these classes, there's some technical skills that we scaffold, like in radio, they do have to learn how to record audio and how to edit audio and how to use the DJ booth at KXLU and the FM transmitter that we have at the low powered transmitter we have at Otis. But we also scaffold things so that gradually students get more open-ended assignments to the point where at the end it's like, make some radio shows. What is
So
that going to be about? And it's up to you. And thinking about the parameters of like what doesn't already exist that you've already heard, what fits into what KXLU is doing, because that's our community partner most years, and what also pushes the boundaries of what KXLU is doing so that we go beyond what they do. And I think, so what that means is that like, there's not always set in stone what the expectations are because the students are developing it as the class evolves.
so okay. This takes us on a much needed tangent that is very useful for teachers that are saying, well, that all sounds great, but that sounds a little complicated. And okay, let me form my question here.
Mm-hmm.
I think, you know, we had a gathering of teachers back early on that I was involved with, and the phrase learning is a messy process came up. And there were, you know, some people were comfortable with that and others weren't, and it would surprise you who wasn't. Some people you would think would be, but how do you get from the experimenting side of things, if I understand you,
Mm-hmm.
where you have a chance to try things out, you and your students, you send them forth on a couple of experiments.
Yeah.
You've only got a semester. Maybe a high school teacher has a whole year, maybe. They can keep coming back to it.
Yeah, we get 15 weeks, 3 hours once a week.
Yeah.
At
So
Otis. The other class I teach most recently at Otis, I've now done it for, I think this past fall is probably the 4th time I've taught this topic. is uniquely abled, inclusive collaborations. This class works with progressive art studios for adults with developmental disabilities. The structure is set up so that both the process and the experience of making things and getting to know the artists that we're working with, making things in collaboration with them, and the final exhibition are equally important. So and this gets at also something Taniel Morales, that visiting artist from Mexico City, had told my class that just I now stick with in all my classes. He talked about this indigenous population in Mexico, and he asked this class, what's the Occidental or Western reasons for agriculture? Why do we grow food? Everybody in the class said to eat, so we have things to eat. And he said, yeah, this, and forgive me for not remembering the specific name of the indigenous population, but he said in this population, in this community, they grow food to feed the land. And they do agriculture to feed the land. And the food that humans and animals can eat is like icing on the cake, the extra benefit, but not the main purpose. And so he told the class, we are going to engage in a lot of activities that feed our creativity and our souls and our humanity and build relationships with each other. The radio is the extra layer of the extra benefit, but it's not the main goal. And so I say this to all my students. I'm like, yes, I have to grade you on your final projects, but I'm equally interested in the fact that you're going to be developing relationships with each other and with these artists at ECF Art Center and UCPLA's Washington Reed Gallery, and we're going to collaborate with them. And it builds both the partners, goal is to help these adults with disabilities, develop their artwork and foster life as a professional artist, but also build relationships outside of those two organizations. And we want the Otis students to build relationships and experiences across a range of differences, and ability being one of them. And so that particular class is sort of set up so that before the pandemic, we would go to the West Side Art Center every Friday for class. We'd spend times touring the facilities and getting to know the artists. Then they come to Otis and they tour our facilities and get to know the Otis students. And then we go back to ECF and I tell the students, okay, you're gonna sit side by side, share studio space. I don't care what you bring to work on. It could even be for another class, but you're gonna make things next to each other while talking and getting to know each other. Just share studio space. And then gradually, as they get to know each other and develop affinities, they decide who they want to start collaborating with. And we don't know what they're going to make. And then as they make and make and make and make, then we look at it all and we pull together an exhibition. This year, because of the pandemic, Otis was only running online classes. ECF and UCPLA was only doing online programming for their artists. And so we did everything on Zoom. We had about 30 people between Otis students, the artists from those two centers, and staff from those two centers. And I had to just deal with like breakout rooms. The other part of this class was that we had students in LA, but also in Denver, Athens, Greece, Wuhan, China, and Taiwan.
Wow.
All showing up for a class that starts at 8 a.m. Pacific time.
Which is the next day in Wuhan.
Yeah. We would start a little, I tried not to keep everybody on Zoom for 3 hours. So we would start at like 8:30 or 9 most weeks. And we did a lot of breakout rooms. And some of the breakout room time was literally just make art with your webcam on and hang out with each other and hopefully talk about and share what you're making. And so it functioned okay, but it was a challenge. And then, there's the other layer of, it's like the equivalent of the special ed kids going into a mainstream classroom, right? So all of these 30 people with a range of learning differences, a range of abilities, a range of communication styles and abilities. Some had aides, one-on-one aides with them. Some we never saw their face on camera because they had internet issues. Some were only connecting on a phone, and often we only saw the ceiling or the little top of their head. And it was a really wide, range of how, but we made it work. And in the end, we kind of just like, as a group, looked through everything everybody made and decided what gets in the exhibition, and we made an online exhibition.
Can I ask you, this is fascinating. When was this exactly again?
This just happened this fall.
Okay. And how many participants?
We had, I think, 9 Otis students and probably similar numbers from both ECF and UCPLA. So usually on Zoom, we would have like close to 30 people between students, artists from the 2 sites, and staff from the 2 sites.
And without unpacking the things that people can't see or wrap their minds around, how did you handle the sharing? They would do screen sharing?
We did a mix. We actually did mail art. I have actually next to me, one student mailed art to everybody did a project where they had to mail art to each other. So I got these amazing prints from Kayla Medina Villanueva that she sent to her whole group. We also used Google Drive and did a lot of file sharing. And so, for some people, particularly the Otis students, the Google Drive stuff was super easy. For some of the older artists at ECF and UCPLA, who were probably like the age of the Otis students' grandparents, they might have needed more help. So sometimes it just meant like email a file to someone in your group and they'll put it on the Google Drive for you if you can't figure it out yourself. And everybody just helped and made it work.
Well, you know me, I'm interested in that last part because the best laid plans, and you can set these things up and then people stumble and fumble. When the group starts to help each other, that's where the magic is.
Yeah. So, and the other thing I did was, because it's an online class, we recorded all the Zoom classes. That all went up so students, anyone who missed class could review it. Or if you wanted to see things again, we did a in-class demo on how to access the Google Drive and making sure everybody knew. And then I also made like a PDF of screenshots on how to get it from your phone versus the computer versus an iPad. And so that regardless of your ease, there were multiple, this is looking at universal design for learning, right? So there's multiple ways that everyone in the class, regardless of which group they came from, could access the course material through Otis's course management system that only Otis students had, but we mirrored everything in Google Drive. And then, so the partners had it too. And then we did things in the mail, analog style, right? That meant students are sending things from Greece and Taiwan and China and sending things back and forth. It took a little bit longer than expected, but it worked. And then the other thing was, I also, thinking about universal design for learning, give them multiple ways that they can respond to a prompt. There's a lot of reflection that I do in my teaching practice where there's an article they read or a video we watch or an experience that they do through a site visit. And so the Otis students joined Zoom workshops that ECF and UCPLA were hosting. One of the things was to reflect on that experience of now being the outsider joining a class somewhere else, where the predominant group are people with disabilities, and the Otis student may or may not have a disability. And so I tell them the reflections can be written. They can be an audio recording. They can be a video recording. So there's, again, multiple ways to respond. Because for some students, for instance, someone with dyslexia, writing may be challenging for them and they'd rather not do it. But if they can speak, if the purpose of the assignment is that we hear their thought process or understand their thought process and their reflection on the experience, that's more important than
Or
grammar and spelling
or
and
enable them
that,
to
right?
visually represent opens up for, and
Yes, that
it's
too.
my personal feeling, at least with the educators that we work with at our institutes, that I'd like to get more of them to get comfortable with visually representing. But the fact is that quite a few folks are more comfortable with that to start with. Then we want you to write a written reflection, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But
Yeah.
there are benefits to all of them. So this is a fascinating project, and obviously it had its bumps and missteps. I mean, you can't do something like this without bumps and missteps. But you're a raconteur and able to improvise. But you've got to, at the end of the day, it has to work for this group of students. We think of we're in this so-called pandemic age. I mean, there's definitely a pandemic out there, but I think that for all that has been difficult, this situation, has opened up all sorts of possibilities and or forced a lot of folks to start to move, and I would include myself to some degree, to move into directions that have opened up all sorts of possibilities, including the phrase long distance learning never did much for me. I get it with rural communities.
Right. We think about correspondence, right?
Yeah, and I get it that, if you're in podunk somewhere, there actually is a podunk, so I have to find another phrase. I think it's in Missouri, podunk. But if you're in someplace out there, long distance learning is important. But we're talking about something different. We're not talking about uploads and downloads. We're talking about human interaction over either vast distances or even here where we're based in Los Angeles, just with, I mean, I shudder to ask the question. I mean, you're in an art and design college, and I think it's been so hard on so many students. I somehow think the older students, but okay, let me ask this question. How, in whatever way you want to answer, it seems your students at Otis College of Art and Design and other art schools are so dependent on facilities and
Yeah.
everything from giant printers to kilns to whatever it might be. I
Yeah.
don't, you want to talk about that at all?
Sure. So, when the pandemic hit almost a year ago, right? Mid-March, we were told most colleges were about to start spring break when everything shut down. I was in on a few large Zoom calls with professors across the country in the Association for Independent Colleges of Art and Design, or ACAD. And everybody who teaches art and design, particularly studio classes, not, art history, liberal arts classes, they were like, we can translate this to online. Okay. Studio faculty were freaking out, to be honest. Like, how do you teach ceramics like this? How do you teach how to mix plaster? How do you do printmaking? Digital stuff, everybody's like, okay, yeah, we can screen share to do the demos. It'll be okay. We can file share. We know how to do that. But the how do you teach welding, right? All of this. So I think Otis really managed it pretty well. And there's some really, we all struggled in spring because basically we had a lot of, Otis included, but a lot of schools said, okay, we're going to have a 2-week spring break instead of 1 week. And that gives everybody a week to try to translate the rest of their semester into an online class. So we're on semester terms, 15 weeks. So that meant really like the second half of the semester was going to be online. The UC system, I think this happened for them, they're on quarters. So this happened for them in between quarters. So the spring quarter for UC had to be fully online, but winter quarter, they were able to like kind of wrap up as is. So what we did, we did a better job in fall than we did in spring, right? Everyone did, K-12 as well. We had more time to prepare. So what we did in fall, I think initially the college thought we would be able to open, and they were going under, so CDC had thought about, and the Department of Health could wrap their head around labs for science departments in higher ed, had not at all thought about shops and labs for art and design colleges. And so we weren't even on their radar about whether we could open or not, until someone finally said to them, but we have like metal facilities and wood shops and dark rooms and print labs and computer labs. And then they were like, oh, so they kind of put art and design schools and departments in the science lab category in terms of regulations of what could be open and not be open. And so what we did was we set it up so that the campus was closed. We were not running in-person classes. Everything was online, but students could sign up for individual time slots to come on campus and use the facilities. And it would, at a much limited capacity than what had previously been allowed. Seniors who are in academic departments that had their own individual studio space also got permission, but they had to sign up ahead of time, do like a self-health check on an app, get permission to come to campus, only be there for like a couple hours at a time. What we also did though was our department that runs technical support services, which is all the labs and shops, put together supply and toolkits for certain courses. So if you were in printmaking, you got, or a letterpress class, you got your own small press that you got taken home with papers and inks and tools. The ceramic students got a bag of clay and all the ceramics tools they needed. And Joan Takayama Ogawa, who oversees our contemporary clay minor and teaches the ceramics classes and product design, has a vast network of people all over the world. And she just hooked the students up. So if they weren't in Los Angeles and they couldn't schedule an appointment to bring things to get fired at Otis, she found a local studio in whatever city they were in so they could get stuff fired wherever they were.
You all are so cool, because I had this idea that I thought was ridiculous when it occurred to me. So you've got such and such a student from Pittsburgh or Des Moines, Iowa, who is very into welding and the arts with welding, and they can't come to Otis and do their thing, and they could connect with a local welder, but I don't know how that works, but that occurred to me.
Yeah. So my student that was in Athens, Greece, was doing also a ceramics project. And she was like, yeah, I just found the local studio in my town.
How cool is that?
Yeah. I mean, none of it's ideal, but it worked. I've read, there's an article in KCET's Southland Sessions by Anuradha Vikram, and I'm blanking on the artist professor that she interviewed, I think from UCLA, but she talked about her ceramics classes where she got them to dig clay out of wherever they lived, and then talked about the differences of like, it almost like is it great for K-12 to connect to earth science, right?
Well, I mean, I realize, I don't know.
And sociology, because talking about like where the clay comes from and what the... At
a given school, whatever it may be, college, university, or K-12, a business office might have immediate questions about this kind of stuff. I get that. But it seems to me that student in Athens, just for example, something happened that would not have otherwise perhaps happened. And It almost suggests it could be a part of a deliberate, intentional process to connect you on the local, with all due respect to the amazing facilities at Otis or another college. Mm-hmm. There's something, do you think people are drawing, I'm not talking about Otis here, are people drawing lessons from this?
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. I'm right. Like we all quickly realized, especially in Los Angeles, that we don't like our commutes and maybe we don't need to work on site 5 days a week, long hours, right?
I love the 105. What are you talking about? There's nothing, the only reason I come across the 105 is to see you. Go on, continue.
Right. So we learned that. I mean, the pandemic allowed me to have dinner with my family every night, which wasn't happening. I was often getting home because of the commute, 45 minutes. I was getting home often after my husband and son ate dinner, or after my son ate dinner, and then my husband and I would eat at like 9 o'clock at night after our son went to bed. So that's, a benefit for sure. But, there's certain parts of this lifestyle maybe we'll keep, hopefully, but there's other parts that
Well,
are
we,
really challenging.
there are a few other areas I'd love to explore. The idea of students going out in the community and finding their own local, welding person or blacksmith intrigues me. That caught my attention. But there were a few other things I wanted to try to get into with you.
Mhm.
Uh, but there is also the issue, and I wonder what you think about this as candidly as you'd like to share. I mean, one of the things that this COVID thing has done is, just expose in absolute naked relief the equity issues
Right.
out there, and who's got, there are still people with dial up, and who's got good connection and who doesn't. And anyone who's slightly following the news, they haven't been covering it much lately, actually, but they were last spring. I mean, they're huge equity issues. There were public schools in North Carolina and other places sending school buses out or sending trucks out with mobile Wi-Fi. And yeah, we sent those Chromebooks home with kids, but they don't have Wi-Fi, or
Yeah.
who knows what's going on at home.
Yeah. So now I'm an LAUSD parent. My kid is in
Ah,
remote kindergarten.
congratulations.
And
Kindergarten,
I, and
cool. It used to be.
so LAUSD sent us, you could either get an iPad or a Chromebook, but they didn't tell you that you had to connect through the VPN.
Are
So we get it home and it's like, this doesn't work. We can't connect to anything.
you kidding?
And yeah, so it's, I think there was a lot of challenges, and now we sort of have the hang of it.
Yeah,
Um, for me, the hardest part was also we don't we didn't have childcare
right.
from mid-March until December, when we finally found a place that my son could go and have someone else supervise his remote learning for 6 hours a day. Um,
But as somebody who's followed your homeschooling journey, and as somebody who thought that was easy when I had one of those little creatures, um, I didn't homeschool, but I know what you're talking about. I can do three things at once. Is what I thought. You you've been doing some very cool stuff with your son, but
yeah, I mean, I've kind of always made things with my son. I mean, my husband's an architect and an artist too. So and he's really into music and sound. So, you know, we've realized that our son is clearly our son and would rather make things than go ride his bike, um, or go play at the playground. So, we've always done that. And I would, bring home. So when the pandemic first started, one of the first things I did, because I don't have a real studio space anymore. I'm in a studio, but it's really just the third bedroom in the house we're renting. And so a lot of my studio supplies are in storage. So one of the first things I did was I went to storage and I collected a bin of scrap fabric. And my son and I started making costumes. And the first thing, and they were kind of like him wanting to make it and then him art directing me to make it, right? So we made the green ninja from Ninjago, was the first one. And I got that done before I got our COVID masks made, because it was like kind of an easier thing to engage him with. Like he'd pick out the fabric and he kind of would draw a picture or we'd look on the iPad for the character he wanted. And then I'd cut out the fabric and he'd sit next to me while I'm pinning. And I taught him how to use the sewing machine. He did not sew the costumes, but he would sew like on scraps and stuff. And then I was really frustrated at the beginning too, because I realized, there were a lot of social media posts from artists who were just reveling in all this free extra studio time they had. And what are you going to make? Everybody was excited about all this free time. We don't have to deal with the social aspects of the art world. We can just make stuff in our studio. And I had less time because I had a full-time job as an administrator, expecting me to still do my full-time job. But the preschool my son was at had closed. So, and I do have a partner and a husband who we split our days in half. So we shared that responsibility as much as we could. So initially I was annoyed. And then I reminded myself of Meryl Latterman-Ukeles, who's an artist based in New York who became known in the 60s and 70s for what she called maintenance art. And she was the first artist in residence with the New York, maybe the only artist in residence with the New York City Sanitation Department. But she started this work. She wrote a manifesto that talks about the life of, I'm an artist, I'm a mother, I'm a wife in random order. I'm all these things. I'm paraphrasing now. And her saying, basically, everything I do is art. Cleaning the house, changing diapers, all of it is art. And that's that's what I'm saying right now, so that I don't have to separate life, motherhood, and art making. And so I revisited that manifesto, and I just said, okay, yes. So everything I do with my son right now, that's the practice, because I don't have time to edit the podcast or to record more episodes. I don't have time to do the artist book project I was going to do, or this video installation I was going to do. So it's just that. So yeah, it kind of just became me trying to take more seriously the projects that my son and I were already doing, and then documenting them on Instagram and my website.
Yeah, and clearly, I understand what you're talking about, and I think everyone can grasp at this. It's life. I don't know what's the phrase. Life becomes art. Art becomes life. I mean, in other words, and yes, you sacrifice some things, and you're a mom. Maybe some other artist is not, but it's all feeding a process.
Yeah, and I think my son probably had the best summer ever.
No kidding.
Right? Like hanging out with mom and dad and
Don't you think?
and making stuff. He had a great time.
Don't you think? So let me we could talk more about that. I'm trying to keep us sort of focused. I let's see. I'm not sure in which order. Maybe it doesn't matter. But I think that what you just talked about will resonate with a lot of teacher homeschoolers and people in general.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you've been really good at making the most of the situation, which is one way to put it. Can you, let's see, I'm going to do this in order. Can you relatively briefly, can you go rewind back? You were a behavior therapist for students with autism.
Mm-hmm.
And you had a pivotal summer. And some of us have had pivotal experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Can you connect that to where you are, to where you went?
Yeah. So
and give us context. You were in upstate New York.
No, I was not. I was in Hartford, Connecticut.
Hartford, sure.
Yeah. That's where I went. I went to Hartford Art School at University of Hartford.
Wadsworth Museum.
Yep. Which is where Meryl Latterman-Ukeles washed the steps.
That's an awesome museum.
Yeah. So I was in Hartford, Connecticut, and I had just gotten I was a year out of grad school. I'd just gotten accepted. I'd spent a year working in admissions at Hartford Art School, and I taught in their pre-college, or I TA'd in their pre-college program. I had also, I was a lifeguard summers home from college, and I taught swimming lessons, and I had gotten a job as a lifeguard for the summer because I wasn't working. They didn't need me in admissions in the summer. And then but I was like, I don't really want to do this, but I don't know what else to do. And then there was a flyer at the art school for um, a therapeutic art and recreation program at Long Lane School in Middletown, Connecticut, which is like in where Wesleyan University is. And that school no longer exists, but it was part of the Connecticut Department of Children and Families. So I applied and I got the job, and we had a month of training, and I taught portrait sculpture and black and white photography. I knew just a little bit more than the students did. It was like, I had taken an intro dark black and white photo class in undergrad. I had TA'd for a portrait sculpture class before in the pre-college program at Hartford Art School, and that's it. But I was like, yeah, I think I could teach these things. That's what I'll teach. And we had very small class sizes, maybe 6 kids. It was a residential facility with both an open campus and a lockdown facility. And we had to censor gang colors and gang symbols. We had police on campus. So the thing that stood out for me, I had a couple friends who were teaching in the public school system in Hartford, Connecticut. One was a music teacher and one was an elementary school teacher. And they both talked about the struggles of like, if a kid acts out, sure, there's detention, sure, you call the parents, but there's not like a lot of real consequences. At our school, there were, right? A kid could have their sentence extended. They could get new charges put on them. There was very serious consequences for behaviors at that place. So the students were really well behaved for the most part. And they had to apply to get into the program. This was like a reward for them. Not every student got these art classes. And we also had an exhibition at the end. So the first piece of art that I ever bought was from one of my students named Rashad, who it was his portrait of his clay portrait of him, and I still have it. And it was probably really cheap. I don't know what he was selling. I don't remember, like $20 or something. But the thing that really struck me was how, for a lot of the students, it really felt like us praising them for their artwork was the first time anyone told them that something they did was good. So that I always refer to that as a pivotal summer, because that was the moment that I realized, yes, I want to be teaching. Like there's power in having access to arts education. I knew when I finished grad school that I wanted to teach, but I was like, okay, I'll either teach at-risk youth, people with autism, or college. And I ended up kind of doing a little bit of both until the full-time college gig panned out. And then and now I feel like with the classes that I teach, particularly the uniquely abled class, I still can have my foot in the world of disability arts. And yeah. And I have an affinity for, I connect with the students at Otis who art is what saved them. Art is what kept them in school. I come from a very low income family, single parent family, where my mom made less than my college tuition. And that was, in the 90s. So tuition was like 20,000 a year instead of 50,000 a year. And she was putting 2 kids in college. So she used to joke like, it's a good thing we're poor. Look at all the financial aid you got. So I connect with those students, recognizing that like an art education, everyone should have access to this, not just those who can afford to live in the wealthy, well-funded school districts, not just those who can afford to pay full tuition at the private art schools.
Well, and it's the same thing you're saying. Yes, it's exactly what you're saying. It also makes an extremely strong case for why the arts, which have been just like dismantled and destroyed in Los Angeles and many other places, need to be a part, not just a part like a extremity. They need to be a part of the core. And Do you remember, no tangents here, but do you remember the prison art project in Hartford? You saw
Hmm.
that?
Yeah, a little bit. I don't think I ever, I just read about
Like
it.
late 90s. That blew me away. It's one of the most powerful art exhibits I've
Yeah,
ever.
it's strange that I never, that it was late 90s, because that is, I think it was probably 98
Eight.
when I worked at Long Lane School.
That's right.
But I think I read about it after the fact. I did not know about it when I lived there.
Well, it's everything you're talking about. So, okay, so let me quickly move on. I would think that we would love to hear about We Are All Americans.
I'll
Okay.
give you the really brief
Well,
spiel
you know,
if I can.
say it the way you want to say it. I mean,
So,
it's an amazing ongoing project. I think it might be on hold due to the pandemic, but it's an ongoing passion of yours.
yeah, and well, in spring 2018, I had a sabbatical from Otis. My original proposal was that I was going to make an artist book and a video in response to these letters my great grandfather wrote to my great grandmother during World War One. Neither of those projects are finished several years later. What I ended up doing, I did, start them, but I also started other things. So I realized within those letters, I found my great grandfather's naturalization papers. He was from Russia, and he did not get his citizenship until after he completed US Army service during World War One. Another great grandmother, um, these are all on my mother's side. I had always been told that she came to the US on a fake passport. She apparently it was a passport of a deceased person, not like a fabricated one, but it wasn't hers. So it was still considered, I would say, fake. Um, so those two moments in my family's history have always had me really cognizant of the fact that as a descendant of Ashkenazi Jews, if my family had not left Eastern Europe when they had, which was early 1900s, um, I might not be here, right? So I've always connected with other, felt an affinity to other immigrants, and recognizing that people leave places to get a better life. And because wherever they're coming from is that bad, that they're willing to risk everything they're risking to go to this new place, right? So, right, it's 2018. Trump's trying to build a border wall. Trump is closing, um, shutting down travel from certain countries. And I don't remember exactly now when the migrant concentration camps at our border with Mexico had begun. It may have been around that time too. But all of this was in my consciousness. And initially I thought, I was talking with Side Street Projects in Pasadena about doing a community project with them. Initially, I thought I wanted to gather immigrants and veterans and record oral histories with them and develop a project collectively with them. And I wasn't sure what that project was going to be. And we tried really hard to we organized a day where we would do oral history recording workshop, similar to what I've done with CWI, where I teach them how to use the recorders and we record stories. And nobody came. We could not get anyone to come to the workshop except one family who are just like Side Street regulars. And they showed up, this mom and daughter, and they were like, "Hey, we're here. What's happening today?" And I said, "Well, we're recording oral histories. I'm particularly interested in veterans and immigrant stories. But because this was an African American family, I also said to her, I know that not everyone came here willingly." And she gave me this like nod of agreement and said, "Okay, yeah, let's do this." So we recorded that story, and that conversation became the first episode of this podcast once I understood what I was going to do. But it also opened up and made me realize that my interests were broader, and that the project was bigger than just immigrant and veteran stories, that it was just like, what does it mean? First, how do we pass down stories from generation to generation? But also, what does it mean to be American in this context of multiculturalism, immigration, military service, Black Lives Matter, white privilege, indigeneity, all of these things intersecting each other. Um, and the part of this conversation with this, basically the daughter who was, I think, 10, recorded the conversation, and the mother and I talked. And we ended up talking a lot about at what age and how do you teach your children about the difficult parts of our American history that affected our families personally. This woman talked about needing to help her daughter do like a family tree timeline project, and how she tiptoed around the fact that her family were descendants of slaves. She never once in the whole conversation said the word slave or slavery. It was that hard to talk about, and I get it. Um, and so and I talked about, like, yeah, my family always told us about cousin Louisette, who survived the Holocaust because she was hidden by nuns in a convent. And it was just kind of our common knowledge. I don't remember how old I was when I was told this. I was just, we knew this. But how do you tell that to kids, and when is it when do you teach them, and when do you try to keep them innocent and sheltered from that? But that conversation is what opened up the project. So I've now done 2 seasons of episodes with a wide range of people. This summer I did do some recordings. I think I did 3 on Zoom, and I did 4 as a workshop at the Institute of Contemporary Art in downtown Los Angeles as part of their field workshop action project series. But I've only just now begun editing because I just didn't have time to deal with it when I didn't have childcare. So maybe season 3 will be released in a month or 2.
Oh, well, you need make no excuses to us. No, you've got to come on. I'm sitting on more unfinished projects than you. Let's put them up there. But I think we have on our Institute Spotlight page. I'm checking right now. I think, yeah, we've got a link. So for anyone who wants to know more, or to see what this is, a work in progress, that's how it works. You can go to communityworksinstitute.org and find the Spotlight series under Teaching Community, and you'll find a link to Michelle's ongoing project. It says most recent, but it's really an ongoing project. And the best projects, I think, are ongoing. Just
Thank you.
So enough with the apologies. Last but not least, can you connect, OJ? There are many other things I want to ask you, Michelle, but I'm going to limit myself. Yes, you did. You've done a number of workshops at our summer institutes at Otis, the Summer West, and you did one that was more or less audio-based oral history projects, mutual interviewing. And can you give us, let's set it up. These were teachers. We're trying to do the opposite of intimidate teachers to think this is doable with their students. You basically had a number of audio recording devices that were not expensive, can be purchased. Feel free to give a shout out to your favorite company there, but these were affordable devices. And we paired the participants up. These are teachers, K to 16 and community teachers, and had them practice the art of interviewing, which is something we've continued to do through our virtual institutes. Can you talk about that a little bit? I mean, how receptive were they to that, and what came out the other end? This was like
I think if I recall correctly, what I did was I gave them choices where there were 2 sets of questions or prompts that they could reflect on. One was very specific to We Are All Americans, and it asked to tell a story of how their family came to the US. and what they think it means to be American, and to do that in a conversation, share those stories with another participant. And then the other choice was to make up their own questions and talk about another topic that they were interested in.
So if I
Um,
may, you framed it tightly with a theme, and then you gave them an open-ended option.
yes, because I also, figured they might not all be interested in that topic,
Right.
and I also gave them the option to, um, if they talked about the We Are All Americans topic, they could decide after the fact if they wanted their recording to be part of the podcast. And interestingly enough, I think I ended up with like half the people saying yes and half not responding, but they never matched up. So I never included these in the podcast because I never had two people in the same recorded conversation agree.
Ah,
So that's why they never got put in the podcast series. But
by
um,
the way, we can follow up on that because we we're the documentation hounds. We have all of those.
so anyways, the we talked a lot about like yes, you can use these digital audio recorders that might be a couple $100. They're ironically called Zoom, but it's I think a different company than the web
They're little
video chat
square,
Zoom.
square devices with
Yeah,
a
but you can
mics.
also do it on your cell phone.
Sure.
And now in our community radio class, we're telling students use Zoom
Yep.
to record conversations like this, like you and I are doing. And um, that was, I think we did that in 2019. I don't remember a lot about the response. I do remember like sitting in the car with one participant as we were driving downtown, and she was thanking me for that and saying that normally she would not have shared that,
Yeah.
whatever story she shared, and how at first it sounded really difficult, but in the end it felt good to have been able to have that conversation and share that. Um, and some people, it's also hard. When I do it in workshops, we try to do it make the conversations about 20 to 30 minutes.
Mhm.
Um, and so some people have a hard time keeping it in that duration, and some people are really brief and have a hard time sharing.
Yep. That's
So
that's the way it seems to work. We've been and I think we borrowed from you to some extent, and we've been doing that in our virtual institutes, and it's been fascinating,
yeah.
the outcomes of that. So that leads me to my last question. Um, I I don't know when I came upon this, but public audience is huge, and you're an artist,
Mhm.
so maybe artists think that way intuitively, the public audience piece. I don't think the teachers typically think that way intuitively. And for the kind of work we're talking about, community-based learning, uh, you know, oral history projects, ethnography projects, audio projects, whatever it may look like, can you, I'm putting you on the spot here, can you talk about why the public audience piece is really huge, particularly for students, and creating a sense of something important is happening? Did I frame
Yeah.
it right?
Yeah. I would say for a lot of artists and designers, they do think about the public audience, but then there's also a subset of artists and designers who, probably more fine artists than designers, who think more about, I need to make this and I don't care if anyone sees it, or I make it and it's for an individual person or for an intimate group. Um, but I think for students, there's there's something about the it's like a healthy set of little bit of pressure, right? If it's going out into the real world outside of the classroom and more people are going to see it and experience it and hear it, um, there's a you want to refine it a little bit more, right? You want to put in extra effort because you don't want to be embarrassed, right? About what you're putting out into the world. So I think that kind of little level of helps students get motivated to feel like, oh, my parents are going to see this, or someone else, random person. And, this might also be a lot easier for this current generation of students who are used to social media and they're on platforms that you and I have never even heard of. They're used to this kind of sharing in public persona in a different way, and can probably teach us a lot about it. Um, but I do think that there's, as a teacher, I think it helps students to develop some both professional skills in presenting things outside of the classroom environment to a wider audience in terms of like public speaking skills and presentation, but also professional in terms of like, how do you hang an art show? And how do you interact with strangers that you don't know who are going to ask you about what you've just made and or how do you schmooze in the lobby after the theater production is over, right? All of those kinds of, or after the music concert is over, all of those kinds of parts that are, for a lot of us artists, we're focused on the making part and less so on the promotions and the schmoozing part, but it's still a skill we have to learn. And I think regardless of what field students are going to go into, right? You're a scientist, you've got to present a paper at a conference, or um, you're an engineer, you got to pitch something to your boss or to a client. Like all of those kinds of talking in the public is very helpful for students to, and I think that, so taking it out of the context of just this is going to go on the wall in the classroom and no one else is going to see it, adds a little bit more pressure to refine it, I guess.
Well said. I think that's what I was getting at. And I also totally respect the other piece that you brought up in the very beginning, that for artists, but certainly for students too, there are some pieces that are created for personal um,
Mm-hmm.
edification. I mean, and personal purposes, and that's important. Journal writing, any number of type things. But I think what a lot of us have found, you and your colleagues at Otis, is that when you introduce a public purpose, a public audience in a safe way,
Yeah.
um, it's a game changer.
Well, like in my uniquely abled class, for instance, the attendance is really high. And I think even though it's a Friday 8 in the morning class, art students do not want to go to class Friday 8 in the morning. College students in general, right, don't want to do that, but they show up. And I think a lot of them talk about, even if if someone's late and I text them and say, hey, are you coming? They're like, oh yes, I don't want to let the partner down. And that I think is also really big, that they feel this connection with who we're collaborating with, and they don't want to let them down. I mean, I think that's great, like that kind of attention to who that's the reciprocity part again, right?
Yeah, but I think you just, you know, complicated my thinking, because you said it really well. It's like, we've thought a lot about these core principles, but nowhere in there does it say, let's not let our partner down. But that's you know part and parcel of what we're talking about, and it also relates to the public piece.
Mm-hmm.
And you
Mm-hmm.
don't want to create an unrealistic pressure or an unhealthy pressure with the public piece. And then there's the collaborative piece and the reciprocity piece. But at the end, you want to find, and I think most sentient, intelligent teachers can find a way to this. What does it look like for a healthy development of a project where you have a commitment?
And it's got to be that balance of allowing for messiness and failure,
Yes.
because they're students,
Yes.
right? And they need to be allowed to fail if that's what happens, and to make mistakes. And
I would
and
even add to that, teachers need to be allowed to fail.
yeah, so the public part throws in a challenge, because there's then also the pressure on the teachers to put out good examples of their student work.
There you go.
But we have to allow for I think the messiness and the failures too. And not everybody wants to see that, but I think it still has to be part of the process.
I think so. And I think that's the messy piece is an excellent place. You framed it really well. Michelle, I want to thank you so much for joining us on CW Spotlight Series. And it's been an absolute pleasure, as is every conversation I have with you. I always learn things. So
Thank you, Joe. It's always a pleasure talking with you. And I'm honored that you invited me to be part of the series.
are you kidding? Thank you. So thank you very much. And we'll talk soon, eh?
Sounds great. Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Bye.